Let's talk about the steps to using this template. The first step is that you have to identify your standard. You don't want to just plan a unit in a vacuum. You want to make sure that every unit is tied to one or more standards. Secondly, you want to identify the thinking process involved. How do you ultimately want students to think about your standard? Because after you've identified your thinking process, the next step is to identify the thinking skills. And if you'll remember, a thinking process is a combination of two or more thinking skills. So once you identify your thinking process, you're going to look at that process and figure out what thinking skills are involved. And then you'll identify the content learning and organizing strategies that you're going to use to help students develop the thinking skills, that ultimately develop the thinking process, that ultimately develops the student's mastery of the standard. And finally, you're going to look for opportunities to adapt. And then after you do that, you can use the graphic organizer to plan your individual lessons. Now, what I like about these steps is it really captures that backwards design principle because you're not going to plan your unit starting from the very beginning. You're going to plan backwards, thinking from your standard all the way back. And this template allows you to be able to do that. Let me show you how it works. So step one is we're going to identify the standard. Now, I'm a former English teacher, so I've chosen a Common Core standard for 6th grade students. And the standard is one that really involves more than just English and language arts because it also involves social studies and science or any subject where students have to write research. So the standard that I've chosen is, and I've copied it straight from the Common Core documents, is simply to cite specific textual evidence to support analysis of primary and secondary sources. Now, once I've written my standard, now I can start thinking about my essential question. And so in order to develop my essential question, I really started thinking about, okay, why is the standard important? Why is it that students need to use textual evidence to support analysis of primary and secondary sources? And after I thought that through for a while, I realized that the reason we need to do that is because this helps students evaluate the validity of sources, which has all kinds of real-world applications. So my essential question really started from there, and my essential question, the one that I came up with, was how can you determine whether primary and secondary sources provide adequate support for your thesis? Now, based on that essential question and based on that standard, I'm ready to go to the thinking process. And my essential question, when I really thought about it, gave me clues about the kind of thinking process I wanted to use. But first, let's look at the thinking processes that are available to me. There's several thinking processes, and you can find these in my book, How to Plan Rigorous Instruction. Now, based on my standard and my essential question, and remember, my essential question was, how can you determine whether primary and secondary sources provide adequate support for your thesis? There's a keyword there that tells me what thinking process I'm really leaning towards, and that keyword is determine. So the thinking process that I've chosen is decision making. Now, once I choose the thinking process of decision making, I can use the book How to Plan Rigorous Instruction to look at what is involved in decision making and how do I use decision making how do I teach students use decision making to help students think about my content in highly rigorous ways. And so let's go back to my template. Now, as you can see, I've identified a thinking process, and the thinking process is decision making. And so I took that decision making and broke it down. So what am I going to do? What kinds of decisions am I going to have students make? And I decided that students will select a total of 10 primary and secondary sources and support their thesis, and then they're going to defend their choices. And they're going to analyze these sources and provide textual evidence to support their thesis statements. So based on that, I determined an objective, and my objective is students will determine the value of primary and secondary sources to support their argument and provide textual evidence to support their decisions. So that objective and then the decision-making process and thinking process I want them to be involved in is very connected. And finally, I thought about my summative assessment. Why are they doing this? How ultimately will I determine whether or not students are using this thinking process effectively? Now, this is a standard that's kind of rooted in a research strand. So ultimately, kids are going to be writing a research paper. So I decided my summative assessment was going to be a research paper plan, where students will use textual evidence to support their choices of primary and secondary resources that best support their thesis statement. So that's my thinking process, and notice I've already kind of determined what my summative assessment is going to be, and I've thought all the way through assimilation and have an objective. It gets me very focused. Now, I've just done the hardest part of this whole process. Once you determine what the assimilation objective is, the rest gets a lot easier. And that's because assimilation is a thinking process, and a thinking process is a combination of two or more thinking skills. So the next step, step 3, is to identify the thinking skills. And there are several thinking skills I can choose from. But based on my thinking process of decision making and based on what I want kids to ultimately do in order to master that standard, I have determined that the two thinking skills that are most involved in the kinds of decisions my students are going to have to make are analyzing perspectives and constructing support. Now, how did I determine that? Well, I looked at this thinking process of decision making. I looked at what I wanted my kids to ultimately do, and I thought about what thinking skills will help my students get there. I also went to page 78 of How to Plan Rigorous Instruction, and on that page is a whole chart that shows you every thinking process that we've mentioned and the possible combinations of thinking skills. So I used that chart to help me kind of figure out, well, what's involved in decision making at this point? And that chart helped me to determine these are the thinking skills that are most important. So now I'm ready to go to my template and add the thinking skills to my template. Now you're looking at a final version, but let me talk to you about my thinking that went into it. My two thinking skills are analyzing perspectives and constructing support. So the first thing I did was I wrote thinking skill objectives. Students will analyze the various perspectives presented in both primary and secondary sources and determine which perspectives are valid and best support their thesis. That one is based on an analyzing perspectives thinking skill. But then I have another objective that has to do with the constructing support thinking skills, and that one is students will construct support using textual evidence to analyze primary and secondary sources. Now, based on that, I break those thinking skills up into two things. Remember, this thinking skill and this thinking skill go into this process of decision making. So I have things like they're going to describe the point of view of the author and use textual evidence to describe the reasons for the author's perspective. And then in order to make sure that kids are developing the analyzing perspectives thinking skill, I need a formative assessment. And my formative assessment is that students will analyze the perspectives of the authors of a primary and secondary source. How does point of view affect each author's perspective? So that's going to be a little quiz that I'm going to give kids throughout just to make sure that they are doing a good job of ultimately applying this thinking skill to the material and analyzing perspectives. Now, under constructing support, my formative assessment is going to be a worksheet. They're going to read a passage, answer questions, and use textual evidence to support their answers. Because this one is really about how do they learn how to construct support. So in this case, I'm going to be doing lessons about identifying effective textual evidence or citing textual evidence or connecting textual evidence to the thesis. So those are going to be my lessons. And each one of these will probably require an individual lesson, and each one of these will require one or more individual lessons as well. So even as I'm thinking through how I want my kids to develop their thinking skills for both of these thinking skills, I'm also identifying the kinds of individual lesson plans I'll need to create. Now remember, that was figuring out assimilation was the hardest part. Once you do that, your thinking skills become a lot more obvious. And then once you've identified your thinking skills, then you have to figure out, okay, what kind of content, what kind of learning strategies will my students need in order to be able to develop that thinking skill about this particular topic. So I look at learning and organizing strategies. And some learning and organizing strategies I might choose are graphic organizers or memory strategies, non-linguistic representations, and so forth and so on. You have the list there on your screen. But there are more. This is just a representative sample of the learning strategies and organizing strategies that I could use. And I've thought through my unit, and I keep thinking, okay, if they're going to be doing analyzing perspectives and they're going to also be constructing support, the learning and organizing strategies that will best help me are graphic organizers, activating and building prior knowledge, and structured note-taking. So let's see how that works in my unit plan. Now you can see here on this last column, I've developed some acquisition objectives based on the thinking skills and the thinking process I ultimately want my students to engage in. So my objectives are students will understand the difference between primary and secondary sources, students will correctly cite textual evidence using ELA style, and students will identify effective textual evidence in support of a thesis. So For this thinking skill, analyzing perspectives, these are the concepts my kids are going to need to know. They're going to need to know point of view, perspective, first, second, and third person, and then also some vocabulary, primary source, secondary source. Those are some vocabulary that my kids really need to know in order to ultimately be able to analyze perspectives. Now, for the thinking skill of constructing support, what are the concepts my kids need to know? Well, they need to know what textual evidence is. They need to know what MLA style is. They need to know what in-text citation is. They also need to know the difference between summary, paraphrase, and direct quote, because all of those things are going to help them identify and record the textual evidence they're going to need to ultimately construct support. So my acquisition strategies, the concepts, the vocabulary, everything that I'm using, I'm ultimately going to use in order to develop a particular thinking skill. So they should be directly connected to the thinking skill. Now throughout, I can identify formative assessments, give short little quizzes, or maybe collect some homework to make sure that they understand these concepts or that they understand this vocabulary. But that's what I'm going to do for my acquisition section. Now, after that, I want to look for opportunities to adapt here because the 4 stages of rigor seem very sequential, and when you're delivering instruction, they will be very sequential. But when you're planning backwards, it's first a good idea to get the whole foundational concept together and then go back and look for adaptation, because if you start with adaptation, there's nothing yet available for you to adapt. So plan the entire lesson out through assimilation, application, and then acquisition. Then go back to adaptation because now you have opportunities to really adapt. And there's several different ways you can adapt. You can add an additional item of content, or you can add another constraint, or you can add one additional condition, or you can add a real world component. And in this case, you're also thinking about ultimately developing habits of mind. And these are the 16 habits of mind that have been identified. And so you can look through these habits of mind and say, ultimately, what am I helping students develop? What habit of mind am I hoping to cultivate? Now remember, no one unit is going to help kids entirely master a habit of mind. Because it's a habit, you have to help kids repeat those habits over and over and over again. But you can look for opportunities within your unit to reinforce a habit of mind. In my case, I'm going to look for the opportunity to reinforce the habit of mind of thinking flexibly, because that really is a good connection to the whole idea of analyzing perspectives. So my objective, which is really an adaptation of my assimilation objective, is that students will determine the validity of an author's argument based on their analysis of how well the author uses primary and secondary resources. So it's just a riff off of what kids are going to do here at the assimilation level. And here's the real-world novel application. Students will examine a cited website and determine whether the information is accurate based on their analysis of an author's use of primary and secondary sources to support his or her thesis. Now, notice, once kids are able to do this summative assessment, now they're able to apply it not just to things that are going to support their thesis, but now they can go back and do a deeper analysis of primary and secondary resources by looking at how another author uses those resources. Now, once you've done all of that, you can use your graphic organizer to plan your individual lessons, and each of those bullet points under those thinking skills and thinking processes can become an individual lesson. But this graphic organizer gives you everything you need to start planning your individual lessons. Now, if you want some lesson planning templates for acquisition, application, assimilation, and adaptation, you can find them at www.mindstepsinc.com/rigor.